There's two different items. The first item I'll address is H.R. 2546, the Protecting America's Wilderness Act, measures the collection of 6 bills reported out of the Natural Resources Committee, all of which purport to move lands into the National Wilderness Protection System or into the National Wild and Scenic River System. While I think all members of Congress would agree that protecting public lands is an important goal, Republicans have some real concerns about this package. First, not one of these bills has a single Republican co-sponsor, and 5 of the 6 failed to garner any Republican votes in the Committee on Natural Resources. That alone should be a warning sign to the majority. Second, each of these bills is going to remove large swaths of land in rural areas from development, which threatens the economic base of these regions. In many cases, the bills that are part of this package do not even have the support of the member in Congress in which the lands are located. Proposing to move lands like these into federal protection without getting buy-in from the people who are most directly affected and without ensuring the economic base of those regions won't be affected is a sure recipe for failure. And third, Republicans in the Committee of Natural Resources have expressed grave concerns that these bills do not take into account the real need for fire prevention plans and policies. Recent history has shown a need to ensure that fire prevention plans and policies are continuously updated and put into place, particularly to protect America's public lands. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the Natural Resources Committee as they address these concerns. Our other item today is H.J. Res. 79. The majority claims that this bill is a vote on the Equal Rights Amendment, the proposed amendment to the Constitution to ensure equality of rights under the law on the basis of sex. But all this measure actually does is attempt to turn back the clock and retroactively change the deadline for states' ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment that was set in the 1970s. As such, this is not, in fact, a vote on the Equal Rights Amendment, but an unconstitutional legal end run around the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution. Well, I think everyone here today would agree that discrimination on the basis of sex is wrong. I think we should be clear about what the majority is doing today. And to understand that, we need to put today's resolution in the appropriate context. In 1972, both the House and the Senate passed the Equal Rights Amendment by a 2/3 majority. At the time, Congress explicitly set a deadline for ratification, stating that the amendment, quote, shall be valid when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission by the Congress, unquote. That meant that the deadline for gaining ratification was March 22nd of 1979. As of March 22nd, 1979, 35 states had ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. Of course, 5 states had also rescinded their ratifications prior to that deadline. And I would be curious to know if the majority thinks those ratifications are legally valid. In 1978, Congress passed a joint resolution that extended the ratification deadline to June 30th, 1982. Since this resolution was not part of the original resolution proposing the Equal Rights Amendment, and because it was adopted by a simple majority rather than a 2/3 majority required for a constitutional amendment, it was almost certainly unconstitutional. But ultimately, it didn't matter because no other states ratified the Equal Rights Amendment by the extended June 30th, 1982 deadline. Now, 37 years after the second and probably unconstitutional deadline passed, the majority is now trying to turn back the clock and claim that there should be no deadline at all for the ratification of this amendment. And that's what today's resolution does. It simply seeks to remove the deadline for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, nothing more. Mr. Chairman, this is a highly unusual and unconstitutional action for the House to take. Accordingly, according to the Congressional Research Service, requiring a deadline for states to ratify a proposed constitutional amendment is not uncommon. In fact, it's been included in every proposed amendment since the 18th, with 2 exceptions, the 19th Amendment and an unadopted child labor amendment. But what has never been done before is what the majority is attempting to do with this resolution, retroactive removal of that 7-year deadline after the fact, and to do so by a simple majority vote in Congress. What's even more remarkable is how long it's been since the deadline lapsed. Even looking at the second ratification deadline of June 30th, 1982, Today, there are 20 members of Congress who weren't even born yet when that deadline passed. That's 20 of our colleagues, nearly 5% of the House. Simply astonishing. I note also that there are real concerns among members about the ultimate impact of the proposed Equal Rights Amendment. The amendment contains no protections for life or of the unborn, and before members scoff at this concern, I note that in New Mexico, which adopted its own state-level Equal Rights Amendment, the presence of that state constitutional amendment was used to overturn New Mexico's equivalent to the Hyde Amendment. Without including a carve-out, the Equal Rights Amendment could overturn every single federal measure that protects life. That's a real concern that needs to be addressed. If the majority truly wants to move forward and pass the Equal Rights Amendment as the 28th Amendment of the Constitution, I'm all for having that discussion. But it must be accomplished using the procedure outlined in Article 5 of the Constitution. It requires hard votes, 2/3 of both chambers of Congress, and the consent of 3/4 of our 50 states. That's the only constitutional way to accomplish that goal, and indeed, that's the only right way to accomplishment. What the majority is seeking to do today does not meet that standard. Instead, they're seeking the easy way out. They're attempting to perform an end run around the Constitution. In so doing, they're asking members, 20 of whom weren't even alive at the time of the second deadline lapse, to turn back the clock and lift a deadline 40 years after it lapsed. And they're doing so heedless of the consequences of their actions. We can do better than that, Mr. Chairman. We should do better. Protecting all Americans from facing discrimination on the basis of sex is a worthy and laudable goal. It should not be cheapened with an extra-legal and unconstitutional resolution like the one we're considering today. That's a disservice to the American people who expect their representatives to uphold and defend the Constitution. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your opening statement.